some people that have the, that pane of glass, as like the subjectivity in itself kind of like disrupted, and nobody talks about this. It's like, that's the thing. There are people that feel like zombies in the world. So who cares about thinking zombies, like thoughts experiments? It's just like, actually, there are real people here that have those experiences, and they feel this way because their subjectivity is kind of like disrupted. So I think we need to have a closer look at this, because I was, like, as I said, fascinated with the subjectivity of the experiences. And this is how I got actually interested in the phenomena. So it's like literally somebody came to me, and then I realized this. So I don't think I ever experienced depersonalization in the severe forms, but I think each of one of us experienced at a certain point in some way or another.
Hi everyone, this is Balázs Kegl. I'm the host of the I Scientist podcast, where we explore artificial intelligence, science, and the scientist behind the science. It's my great pleasure to host today Anna Ciaunica. Anna is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist. She's studying consciousness, self-consciousness, and especially embodied cognition and psychological conditions like depersonalization. So, hi Anna, how are you today?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. This is exciting, and I look forward for the next steps and the questions.
Yes, it's very exciting. I have a lot of questions. Probably we can't finish all of them, but let's try. So, my first encounter with you was through the work you did with Michael Levin on, I would say, like embodied neuroscience, maybe. You correct me if I'm wrong. It's basically challenging the classical picture where cognition happens purely in the nervous system. So we will definitely talk about this work, but before, let's start with the self-introduction. So what especially piqued my interest when I was watching your YouTube videos, that you define yourself as an empirical philosopher as opposed to an armchair philosopher. So what do you mean by that?
Yes, so roughly there is this tradition going back to Greece, where you have philosophers like Plato, where they're basically mathematicians, and they were doing a lot of like thinking with arguments and objections and everything else. And then on the other hand, you had philosophers like Aristotle. They were kind of like to interact with the world out there, and especially the biology, so dissecting frogs and looking at how things are actually working, right? And then try to make sense of it. So it's two ways which I think are complementary. They need to be addressed together. It's like how we approach a certain problem, either just by looking at it as like try to make the measures and bite the bullet, because you know that whatever you measure, you can never measure like entirely, right? So you just like pick one bit of the reality of the phenomena you're interested in, and just try to put a number on that one. Or you take the other side, where you basically look at something which is, how should I put it, abstract or universal, and then work your way down to more empirically based things. So there are ups and downs and pros and cons for each of one of these approaches, but so after a while in my career, I was trained as an analytic philosopher, and I realized that I was not satisfied with that approach. I said I needed something. I want to put like measure and put a number and bite the bullet. Say, okay, I can't have it all. I'm not going to, I'm not going to write like Kant, critique pure reason. So, like a system where I explain everything from some a priori perspective. I said, okay, I'm going to be a bit more modest and just like confined to something that is measurable. And yeah, I can contrast. I can, poke reality with my finger and try to measure it. So let's say that to use metaphor, in this case, I think I'm more tactile researcher rather than visual researcher. So I don't want to sit and think. And actually, when you think about it, just like people say, I see to understand, to mean I understand, I see, hence I understand, right? So I don't want to understand by seeing it. I want to understand by interacting with it in a very tactile way. And obviously it's more messy, but that's okay. It's also more real, Yeah. So that's it, like the background. So I was trained as a philosopher, and analytic philosopher. I worked on physicalism and qualia. So basically, how exactly we have subjective experiences rising from matter, physical matter, and my approach was like the classical problem was like you have the fundamental level, which is the physical level, and on the top you have the cherry on the top, which is the mental events or mental phenomena, and then obviously the problem is how you basically connect the two. And my approach was to basically look at the level, which is, instead of like trying to connect like the two opposites, is to understand very humbly and very slowly how the physical level transforms into the chemical one, and from the chemical into organical one, biological one, and hence so yeah, so that's you'll probably see that actually it's connected with the paper that you just mentioned about cells and non-neurals, and Mike Levin's work is because this is precisely he is doing, right? So it's like you take bits from reality and see how they interconnect with each other at the biochemical level, and then you see how basically this unfolds into something that later on, like an organism, like a human organism, say, well, there is something what it is like for us to, drink a glass of wine or have this conversation here. And speaking of wine, so because I did my PhD in Burgundy, and one of my in Dijon, France, so I worked, probably the famous Mary, the scientist argument by Frank Jackson, an Australian. There's this idea. Do you know the argument?
No.
Otherwise, okay, so it's quite simple arguments. He said it's like imagine you have a scientist called Mary who is born in a black and white environment and stays in a black and white environment till, let's say, when he's 20 something, and she learns through I don't know, television and books and everything what is happening in the human brain when one perceives the red tomato, like color, right? So she has basically all the physical facts of the perception of colors in the brain, but not the experience of actually seeing red, right? And then now imagine it's like when you release her from the environment and you show her a tomato, well, she says something, oh, that's boring, because I already know what it is like to actually, see a tomato, because I know already everything is happening in the brain when you see a tomato. Or there is something new, right? Something that you basically cannot learn or perceive just through like third-person knowledge, like from books, or you basically need to go through the event, through the phenomena, to actually have an understanding of that phenomena. And my argument was like, well, it's like, who cares about red tomatoes? Like, I'm from Burgundy. How about the experience of like drinking wine, red wine? Because again, it's like that example is very visual. So when you change the example to different senses, it's like you have an entirely different stage for your problem, right? So then, is there something what it is like to actually have red wine inside yourself? Yes, many people will say yes, there is, as opposed to just like seeing a tomato from aside, So starting with this example, which is like anecdotal, but actually I think it's quite important. So our perceptual experiences, subjective experience, and conscious experience are necessarily multisensory in nature, and we focus too much on, you know, what I call the distal senses, right? The senses that put us in reality, whereas kind of like tend to overlook like the proximal senses, the one that actually put us, you know, in touch with our bodies. And yeah, so I want to start with the body, not the mind. I think that's, for me, that's the most important starting point.
Yes. So this reminds me actually Mark Strom's argument about qualia. He says the same thing, that where that question went a bit sideways was exactly because they posed it as a question on the visual system and perception. Whereas if we look at more primal senses like pain, then it's not possible to not feel it. So pain is itself a first person experience otherwise, because it's a feeling and you cannot not feel a feeling.
But so I'm sorry, this is the philosopher in me. So I believe that the perception of red and the perception of pain is necessarily subjective, in the sense it's coming from the first person's perspective of I think the point I want to make is that there is something about the perception of inner senses, like interoceptive, like pain and other things, that are necessarily happening like here rather than there. And they are intrinsically related to the survival organism, right? So there is this beautiful example, I think, by Frédérique de Vignemont. She says it's one of her papers, just like if I mean, the perception of the moon and the sky and the perception of the snake close to my skin, my foot, is like really very different for my brain. I mean, if you're optimal and functional, you should probably just like care more about what is close to your body rather than what is on the sky. And everything that basically enters in our body, like the air or the food and everything, it's crucial for survival. Yeah. So that's but I would say that in both cases, like the perception of the moon and the perception of the snake and the pain necessarily comes from the subjective point of view, from the experience of the subject. And that's something that one of the reasons I am actually very grateful for. I've been trained in analytic philosophy with Martini de Rumelin, and she has this beautiful argument. She's based in Freiburg, Switzerland, and she has this beautiful argument of how we cannot talk about experience without talking about a subject of an experience, and that subject of an experience necessarily is kind of like embodied, right? And that's a similar point is made by Gall and Strauss, right? So it doesn't make any sense of talking about experiences. One needs to talk about subjective experience by definition, because those experiences are given to someone, to a subject of an experience that's kind of like necessarily embedded. So this means that from this point of view, necessarily any perception is subjective in that sense, right? Just like it's related to a subject of a perception, a subject of an experience.
Yes. No, I agree with this. Mark says that the problem with vision is that you have a non-conscious vision. So it's there is this separation, but there's no such thing as non-conscious pain. But maybe there is. We will talk about depersonalization, because I really want to understand what it is. But let's go back a little bit to the paper with Michael, where you make a point about the immune system very particularly. But I think the bigger point is that cognition doesn't happen purely in the nervous system. It happens in the body. So it challenges a little bit this pure physicalist notion where you have the body and you have a nervous system, and the nervous system creates the mind. And you talk about how the immune system communicates with the nervous system and how it itself is sort of conscious. And so what I'm interested in the most in this, that basically what I see emerging there is that our cognition is made up by subsystems who themselves are or seem to be conscious.
Yeah, so I need to start with the disclaimer. So the C word, the conscious word, it's a word I try to avoid for many, many reasons. So consciousness is not a word that actually I'm using very much in my research, and actually you're not going to find that word in our paper with Mike.
That was completely I who made it up.
Yeah. And there is actually, first, there is a philosophical reason for that, because as I said, it's related to what I said earlier about Martine, Nida Rumelin. So I was planning to write a paper called Why Consciousness is Not a Thing. And I'm very careful. I'm going to say there is no, there is no such a thing as consciousness. This is what I wanted to call it. And people jump at me and say, what do you mean? It's like, what do you mean consciousness doesn't exist? You're eliminativist about consciousness. No, I didn't say that. I said there is no such a thing as consciousness. So consciousness is not a thing. And by the fact that we are using the pronoun consciousness, people are tempted to slide, to slip into kind of like tacit understanding, like there is I don't know, this object, right? And then this object, which is, let's say, perfume, I just like can move it from point A to point B, can be localized somewhere, I don't know, in the head, the back of your head, the front of your head, somewhere, or in the outer world, yeah, in the spiritual world. But I think that's a misleading way of looking at it. I want to claim that consciousness should be always related to something else, like a property.
Conscious
So
about
conscious
something.
experiences, conscious perception, conscious information processing, conscious states, conscious phenomena. I don't know, something which basically shows that that's a state that needs some sort of like underlying stuff going on, right? And I think that's super important, because then you avoid this tacit understanding of like consciousness being like movable from point A to point B, just like download from the head and put it in an artificial system. Oh yeah, yes, like I'm going to live in my artificial body because my consciousness has been just like moved from point A to from point B. But that's the thing that's wrong. And this is something that's an argument we're trying slowly to build with Mike with this paper, which is the first of a string of paper that actually we plan to write. And this is, I said, it's like let's take it easy, because actually this is big. Yeah. So it's like you don't want to shake the coconut tree too much, because then people get hurt, right? Too many coconuts are falling down, right? So I need to take it like slowly. And the first coconut I want to shake is this idea that the brain and the body are two. I mean, even the distinction between brain and body, right? As if somehow the brain is like the locus of the mind, which I think is a tacit inheritance from the past of the mind-body dualism and the mind-body problem. And we just like remove the psyche and the mind with the brain, but basically we want to say exactly the same thing, right? And I think that's a problem. So that's the first starting point. And the second starting point is that I think the problem is posed this way because we endorse a tacit adult-centric perspective when we look at the phenomena. If you take a bottom-up developmental biological phenomena understanding, like approach on how things basically develop, then you get a very different picture. So my favorite example is that of a tree. So if you want to understand how a tree works, so what is a tree, and you look just at the branches and the trunk, when the tree is already kind of like adult, yes, you have like a clear picture of what a tree is, but it's not the entire story. you basically need to see what's under the visible parts, like the roots, that is not visible immediately. There is something there. And I take that as metaphor for what some people call the unconscious, right? There's like the things that are not necessarily above the threshold of our awareness, that we just like point to it, just like, yeah. So it's the roots, the deep roots, yeah. And the second important point is that those roots, they basically, the tree comes from a seed, right? And the seed has a very different shape, a structural shape, than a full-fledged tree. So if one to understand what the tree is, one needs to understand the transformation of the seed into a tree within a certain environment, within certain circumstances. And I think it's the same for the human cognition, right? If you want to understand what the human cognition is, it's not enough just like to take the Turing test, which is that the classic adult thing. Is just like people say, oh, let's solve some chess problems. And then we boil down to, it's like, it's not working like that, actually. You need so many other mechanisms in place before you actually even get there. And going back to neurons, so if you take development perspective, actually we have neurons in our belly before we have neurons in our brain. So it's like we literally think with our bodies and perceive the world with our body before we perceive with the brain, if we take a development perspective. And because we are self-organizing organism, right? Again, we have cells before we have neurons, and this kind of like develops, yeah. And the reason why we focus on the immune system is because, well, you need to have some sort of like, system in place that tells your organism, oh, this is you, this is not you, this is self, this is non-self, and keeps track of this like core thing that needs to develop and be flexible enough. So there's a trade between, keeping track of the self while at the same time engaging with the environment to get what you need and to make the exchange, right, in a highly dynamical position. So, and based on this idea, what we want to say is that, well, if you keep in mind these 2 points, then it's super important to bear in mind that probably what we call cognitive processing is the result, first of all, of some highly dynamic, interconnected like mechanism that evolves and develops and unfolds and can go wrong, actually, which is, for instance, the case of cancer, right? And it's not just in the head. So it's not just in the brain. It's distributing across the entire single cell in the body, and there is like some concentration of some connection that is happening super fast within the neurons. But the idea is like, in order that supervenes, that's on the top of something else that actually, again, like the roots of the tree, make sure that actually get all the nutrients for the thing to grab the the energy. If you don't have that, and actually all of us kind of like know it, it's like if you're hungry or you need to go to loo, good luck with Turing test, right? It's just like you're not going to pass it very quickly. Yeah. So I think some of the things are kind of like overlooked, and we want to just like put back the spotlight and under the humble organism, right? And in doing so, I was like inspired by a bunch of people. So I'm not claiming that this is like me or new and everything else. I'm just like a part of the bigger team. But I'm really big fan of Pamela Lyon's work on this and some other people that basically distinguish between the anthropogenic and biogenic approach to cognition. So in the anthropogenic approach is like you take the human cognition as a case example, and then you work your way down, and you basically take the human cognition as a paradigmatic case of like cognitive processing, whereas the biogenic approach is to focus on what makes human and what humans have in common with other living systems, because this is basically, that's the basic, right? It's like basic imperative is just like stay alive. You can't cognize anything, you can't do any type of Turing test if you lost track of the basic imperative, stay alive. And that's something we can we share with any single
yes, I agree. But this is exactly when I watch a neuron trying to find his friends, it's really hard not to see consciousness inside, or at least some kind of agency. It's not it's not an object that's, you know, like a machine that just tries to reach out. It really looks like it has a goal, right? So it's still an interesting question to me, how then, if we accept this, that each of our cell has its own consciousness and agency to maintain itself, and then they make up tissues and they make up organs and they make up me. So how are those consciousness levels, even if we don't use the C word, or we
No,
can
I'm
call it
not using
like
the C word.
agency or something like that. So how does this happen, that you have these levels of agencies that build up higher level agencies, and then you need to have communications up and down, right?
Yeah, because I think maybe we are dealing with the wrong ontology here. So in the sense, like, in the sense of looking, okay, so you have the building bricks, yeah, the building blocks, and you ask yourself, as you just did, right? So how we put this together to build whatever, just like hierarchy or something. Or you can ask yourself, so maybe what is really fundamental is not the bricks, like the individuals, but I don't know, for lack of a better word, because I really think we lack the conceptual toolbox to actually address this I think we need new concepts. And we don't have a concept for this, but let's say is like the way things are interconnected and communicate with each other, right? So it's like that's the relatedness, relationality is like the way things are kind of like reach to each other and exchange information. So that very process of like connectedness, I think that's fundamental. And so there is something in the message, there is something in the way things kind of like communicate with each other that may emerge in certain organisms, a certain type of experiences. When in humans we have this like subjectivity, the qualia, what we call it, right? But I think yeah, as I said, it's like I don't think we have the conceptual toolbox to, map that, just as you said, it's like how you call conceptually the very fact of a neuron trying to reach another neuron. Because I think what is really important is not the neuron A and the neuron B, is the tendency to, and I think that's fundamental. So why they are doing that, right? And I don't think we have a concept for that, a good concept, yeah, to describe like that drive to communicate, to exchange.
It's like love, huh?
Yeah, or hate. Yeah, because some things will be like,
Yeah,
oh,
but that's exactly the issue. Like the immune system, exactly what you were writing about in that paper, is its actual goal is to recognize what is foreign to the body. So there must be some kind of concept of even like every level of this agency of some kind of me and not me, right?
yes, but there is also allies, right? So it's like you have things in you that are not you, but in the same time they are you, right? And this is the topic for my our second paper. We almost got accepted, almost, finger crossed, finger crossed. As where we look at in humans, how cells basically connect to another human cells in pregnancy, right? Because the immune system of the pregnant person is mind-blowing, right? Imagine, it's just like, okay, so here's the self, here's another self, another self, but it's still okay because it's kind of like, we are in this together, right? So they create like a new ecosystem, so to speak, a third one, right? So it's not two, it's not one, it's three or maybe more, right? So it's almost like a new entity happening there. And there is fascinating work on this by Jill Moore and colleagues. Yeah. And I think that's super important, because then again, at that level, what is really important is like the level of negotiation that is happening between two living organisms. And we are making the point on this quite strongly, because I think this is super important. It's not an individual within an environment, because the utero is not an environment. The utero is not an object. The utero is another living system. So basically, it's a living system within another living system. Yeah. So the complexity is even more, important, right? So it's like, and it's one of the things I kind of like develop in my work, with this idea of like when the need to go back to the square one. And as a philosopher, I was like so surprised to see that philosophers, they kind of like obsessed about death.
With birth.
But no birth, yeah. And I have a book on this coming. So yeah, watch this page about this. It's like
You mentioned in one of your talks that if Descartes could have got pregnant, we would have had a different path of philosophy.
Right now we'd have a completely different conceptual toolbox discussing about things, right?
So as an AI researcher, I found some of the concepts that you develop in the paper very interesting. Like I knew what homeostasis was. It's about maintaining some vital metrics in the body, and if the body goes out, like you're thirsty, then you drink, you breathe, you keep your temperature in a certain range. And this is something that we can actually sort of formalize in AI. So we have systems that maintain certain metrics in a certain range or optimize some others. But what's interesting about the living system is that it creates itself. So it's a beautiful word. I love this word, autopoietic, because it means I'm creating myself. So I have agency not about what I do, but who I become. And so when it grows, it develops, and it develops by itself. And so it needs more than just homeostasis. And there were two words there that I learned. One of was allostasis, and the other was homeorhesis. And I find these incredibly important from an AI point of view, because we are not even aware of these concepts, like systems that maintain their existence and their metrics, but through development. So you need not to maintain a static state, but a dynamic state that develops. So can you explain this? And so how do they change our concepts of cognition and maybe consciousness?
Yeah, so this is a big topic. So first of all, going back to homeostasis. So actually this one potential starting point is like this, actually Nick Wilkinson preprinted, submitted the paper today, and we preprinted the paper where, again, we combine this idea of like basic homeostatic states and developmental perspective, because I said it's like if you take the things how they unfold, you need to go back literally in this square one. Yeah. So we look at homeostatic self-regulation in utero, and we propose this idea that one basic and highly overlooked aspect is the fact that homeostasis necessarily needs to be defined in relation to the fundamental force of gravity, right? With the fact that you're an object, right, in the world, and you need to just like and that depends on your medium, right, where you are, right, in air and water, on earth, right? It's like very different. So the classic example of this with the Newton apple, just like falls from the tree, right? But an apple falls down on air but goes up in water, right? Yeah. So the way you relate with the environment, most fundamental force, which is the force of gravity, I think necessarily should be built in any type of successful system of like self-regulatory system, because that's something we need to just like navigate the environment. You need to figure out how you do that. And in humans, it's even more interesting, because in humans we are all born in liquid, right, in amniotic fluid. And actually somebody made our co-author on the paper was Takashi Ikigami, is like doing a lot of work on artificial life and artificial conscience, he made this like beautiful remark saying, well, it's like you know that life actually emerged in water, right? So that's an interesting thing. It's like, why water? But anyway, so in our case, so literally we are within a liquid environment, and obviously that's the way you so that's the first point, is like how you relate to gravity, and the second one is like there is always movement. Yeah, it's like there was always something going on, moving. So you have like starters, you have like exchanges, and there's highly dynamic from the very beginning.
And inside too.
Inside too, it's just like it's a constant exchange, and things can go wrong, and you have miscarriages, and people get a pregnant person can get a disease, and from being pregnant, right? So not from the outside. Yeah, so there's many things that need to be taken into account, but basic idea here, as you said, in the autopoiesis, something that Varela beautifully described, and with his colleagues and disciples and students, is that it's an open system. So it's vulnerable, right? So it's just like it needs this like openness and vulnerability to sustain like on the fly. So going back to your question, so yes, homeostasis is super important in relation to this like dynamic, and I think they're almost like I want to say like two faces of the same coin, but actually three faces, right? It's just like everything is interconnected. And again, I think we don't have the concepts to describe this. Like, so how you kind of like disentangle? So we disentangle them conceptually because, well, we are used to this. Just like here is point B, here is point B, here is the brick. How can I connect brick to brick 2? But that's one way of putting things. Going back to my Descartes thing, right? Maybe there are some other ways to actually look into things that are not really so, and maybe that will bring us back to some other languages in the humanity, right? So maybe that's something comes from the way English words map reality. Maybe there is some, I don't know, maybe some languages somewhere in the world that basically map the reality a very different way. They have a way to describe exactly what I'm saying. This interconnected way of like being together. So the way to go forward, I would say, is it's like to start listening from what is coming from a different perspective, because I think that's super important, and getting out of this very heavy inheritance that we have between the mind, body, the soul, the material, immaterial. And I think that's something that is still lingering. I actually, this is an example I'm giving all the time. I mean, the distinction between mind and body is so deeply rooted in our society that we literally have different buildings. If we need to go to the mental institution, and if I have a problem with the liver, I'm going to an institution. If I have a problem, I'm going. So it's like clearly we institutionalize this, and to a point that will build different like branches. But you and me were kind of like just one saying, I don't see your mind floating above your head.
Yeah, and somebody said that basically physical illnesses usually often get cured by looking at your mind, psychology, and psychological illnesses often get cured by fixing your body.
Yeah, so there's beautiful work, emerging work, showing that many of the self disorders, they're actually highly related with inflammatory responses of the immune system, which kind of like makes sense because the immune system is the one keeping track of the self. So
and cancer on the other side.
Yeah. So that's
So I actually wanted to dig deeper a little bit in this almost like epistemic question, like how to do science about first person experience, especially when you have this view that you have where everything is connected to everything. So we have sort of like a gestalt view of the body, yet the toolkit that science gives us is reductionist. So we want to take them apart because we want to understand the pieces. And so what is the methodology for such science where you don't want to take it apart because it's intrinsically the system?
Yeah, so that's a very good question and a very difficult one. And actually, that's something I'm very careful in my research in my lab. So I don't think there is one method. I think the solution here is to approach it through different angles and then try to put the pieces of the puzzle together while bearing in mind that probably the things you are looking for are highly kind of like superimposed on you by the culture background that you have within a given context, right? So, the way, I don't know, a Japanese person approaches certain things, the way a French person approaches exactly the same phenomena might be heavily determined by, the cultural background. So we have, because as I said, we are literally born through others. And we need others from the very beginning. So we are a highly social creature. Ontologically cannot exist without others. So this means that we depend upon a massive network of received knowledge, embodied practices and interaction and everything else. So what I was saying about the body, the fact that internally we already have this like kind of like highly sophisticated entanglement between the different systems. I think that applies to know how the humans are basically in the environment and the social environment as well, because as I said, it's like we cannot be alone. We cannot exist without the others, literally. So this means that we need different methodologies. So we need lived experiences. We need people to tell us what they feel and how we feel, because I think that's super important. We need also to measure physiologically the body, right? So James Ladyman gave me this like beautiful example. So, you take a tennis ball, it's a tennis ball, and I'm measuring. So I take a tennis ball and I'm measuring your skin response, let's say, or heartbeats. Yeah. Why are you watching me? And I smash the tennis ball, right? Nothing happened in your body because, well, that's tennis ball. But if I put a smiley on the tennis ball, right? It's like a smile and two dots and like a face and a smash the tennis ball. You still know it's a tennis ball, but your body will react as if that is a person, even though you know it's a tennis ball. So there is a way your body pre-reflectively, kind of like for your own sake, reacts to something, anticipates something on the basis like, oh, that should be a face, a cute face, or something that shouldn't be that. So there's danger, right? So that's a subject, not an object. So you need to switch yourself on a very different mode. So, and that's also very important to measure, right? So how the body reacts to certain stimuli, not just subjective experiences, because people will tell you something. Actually, we're about to preprint a study that we did on depersonalization. And we found something very interesting, because the way people report the explicit measure of agencies and what you find and the way they actually behave, you see that's something very, very different. Yeah. So it's like the way you feel a phenomena and actually how your body behaves in a certain way in a certain context is something very, very different. So hence the importance to actually have different methodologies. And then you have methodologies like the neural ones, which are also super important. So you need to see what is happening in the brain. And all this ideally when people do tasks in a real time and, naturalistic context, because, putting someone in scan, looking at picture of face is not necessarily a social thing, right? Whereas like if you need to see your boss to ask for a raise, that's highly relevant. So a more naturalistic way. So I think that the answer to your question is multifaceted. So we need methodologies, and hence my bet in developing my lab as an interdisciplinary hub, because obviously you can't do that alone. I mean, it can be good at one or two, let's say 3 methods if you are really, really good. But, again, you depend on others, right? You just like take the data measured by other people, just like rely on what they do, right? As we rely on the knowledge we receive from others. So I think it's a sketchy, endeavor, and very fragile. But well, that's the beauty of it, yeah.
So you mentioned the depersonalization,
Mm.
and I found it a fascinating subject for several reasons. One of them is that it seems to me that it's a quiet, first of all, it's not a black and white condition. You can have more or less depersonalized. And the other thing I'm thinking about is that today it's pretty widespread. And so its consequences are not just happen for the person, but also for the society. Like we can even societies can be depersonalized in a certain sense. So I want to dig into this. So let's start from the beginning. Like, what is depersonalization and how does it look like? Because you mentioned, how does it look like from the outside and from the inside? Because maybe this is not the same. And what is your theory about it? You mentioned terms like sensory attenuation and self-forgetting. So what are those, like those cloud of terms, and what's happening in a depersonalized person?
Yeah, so this is like a very big topic, and I have a lot of research on this, so I'll try to make it short, to like make it like compact. But let me say that when I started to investigate this phenomenon, I was in London, and I and actually speaking of like first person experiences, I spent some time with people with the personalization, try to understand how they feel and interacting with them. And I actually keep these interactions with them. And whenever I organize a workshop on depersonalization, I'm always having a speaker with lived experience of depersonalization giving a talk about how that person lives with and feels depersonalization, and then put the researchers in the same room. And I can assure you the vibe is very different in the room when I have the actual phenomena condition in the room. Yeah. And I think that's super important, because sometimes researchers, going back to the armchair thing, you can very easily be sidetracked and just like be just in your head because you have a theory, but actually it's not really, the phenomena can be very two different things. Yeah. So that being said, so going back to actually everything is related, because it's my thinking. So I started with this idea that selfhood necessarily needs to be related with movement. Yeah, because you cannot, I mean, there is no self without the movement. I mean, there is no self-organizing living system without movement. Yeah. So this means that movement through sensory and sensory perception, because everything goes like together. And when you move in the world, this beautiful example by Jakob Limanowski and Carl Friston paper. So when you pick like something in a tree, like a cherry or whatever, you pay very much attention to, you are very much aware what is happening in the contact between your fingertips and the cherry, but you don't really feel your arm moving, but actually your arm is moving and there is a sensation there. Yeah. It's just like it's processed successfully by your body and brain. It's just like it's processed so smoothly, but you can afford to leave it in the background, right?
This is what you call the transparent background?
Yeah, the transparent background. It's just like you it's there without you realizing it's been there, right? And it gets obvious, it gets visible when what they call there's a crack in the window, right? So if that transparency is like cracked, then two things emerge. Is first of all, you see that there was something there when you thought that there's nothing there. And second is like that very something which is there transparently allowed you to feel immersed in the reality, because now your view is blocked, is blurred, it's obscure, right? You can't really see the window because it's kind of like you see the window that allows you to see outside, right? So we want to say that actually the sense of self is that transparent kind of like phenomena that surrounds every single one of our experiences, and we don't pay attention to it because it's there all the time. We do pay attention to it when something goes wrong, right? When, for instance, in meditation, when I attend to my subjectivity of my experience, so it becomes an object of my awareness, that becomes obvious, it's there. or when something like goes wrong, gets disrupted. So for instance, in the case of depersonalization, which is a condition that makes people feel detached from themselves and their body, and they have that like pane of glass or blurriness between them and the reality, then what is happening there is that these people don't feel in touch with themselves anymore, and they don't feel in touch with the reality there. And there is like, obviously this is like very much an open question. Where does it come from? But I think a fair speculation would be to say that whenever you cannot afford anymore, for various reasons, to process the self in the background, because, I don't know, you feel unsafe or overwhelmed or other things, then you need to basically, because for the survival purpose, you need to keep track of yourself doing stuff. But we know it's like, for instance, if you play tennis, if you or dance, and you're too much aware of yourself, you're self-conscious, and you're not so smoothly as you know, so you stands in the way. So basically you stand in the way between yourself and the self, so to speak, right? So kind of like this hyperreflexivity, and this has been already developed in the field, especially in relation to schizophrenia and psychosis, this idea of hyperreflexivity, where people just like overthink their way through reality rather than just like being an embodied, immersed in the reality. And this is what we add on the top of this idea is, as I said, is like this idea of movement, right? It's like somatosensory attenuation means that we need to attenuate sensory information that is related with the self in movement, in reality, in acting in the world, right? So this means that you need to forget about the self in order to connect with, yeah. So we want to say that it's not self-loss, but rather overlooking the self that's related to depersonalization. It's like too much focus on that. And if that's the case, this means that potential ways to help people to put them back into the body and out, and get him out of their heads and the mind and just overthinking, put him back into the body, is to use sensory engagement, active sensory engagement and movement in reality. Yeah. And again, going back to something that we discussed at the beginning, is like how different senses give you a very different sense of reality. So the people that go through severe episodes of depersonalization, whenever they feel that they get into one of those episodes, they instinctively start moving around and touching things. Yeah. So because touching objects is like Saint Thomas, right? It's like I need to touch in order to say if it's real. So the sense of touch gives you a sense of reality more than the sense of vision. Why? Because it's most pervasive of all senses, right? It's just like cannot not touch. So I'm having this discussion all the time with people working on sensory deprivation tasks, and said, well, that's not sensory deprivation, that's sensory diminishment, because if you're in water, it's just like you're receiving stimulation on your entire skin, and it cannot switch that. Yeah, it's like you cannot. Yeah, even when you sleep, you still touch something. Yeah, so that's your relation to the reality, and it's one of the senses that fascinates me the most, even more than the interoceptive one that are inside, because that's the boundaries between the inner and outer, right? That gives you like that negotiation between the self and no self and the reality. And interestingly enough, fetuses spend a significant amount of time in the womb where vision is very low, touching themselves. So that's the first sense we basically go into reality, just like, whoa, what, this is me, this is not me. And it's like when you touch yourself, you get stimulation, like two sides, yeah, and a relational stimulation. And actually beautiful study that show on twins by Castillo and colleagues in 2010, I think, where they show that
they touch each other.
When you have twins, it's just like they have a very different kinematics when they touch the siblings, whereas like the uterus, right? So it's and other studies that show where it's like when they poke themselves in the eye, they realize, well, that hurts. Then they approach their face slowly, whereas like here they go like that when it's like really slowly, because they say, oh, that hurt. Don't do that again. So touch is the fundamental sense that puts us in reality. And when these people felt detached from themselves and out of reality, they use a lot of like sensory information through tactile interactions. And sometimes they use perfumes, right? They carry a bottle of perfumes with them, and they give themselves just like a powerful shot of like highly powerful perfume. And that again puts people back into the body. It's related
Super
again
interesting.
with the you know, as I said, it's like the survival senses, right? I need to eat, I need to relate with
I see.
the
So lower. I see. I see. I mean, I have so many thoughts. I don't even know where to start. I can connect it a little bit with John Vervaake's 4P, where this is sort of like a problem at the perspectival, where you decide what is relevant. When you walk into a room, you have your, let's say you are a speaker in a conference room, the things that become relevant to you, that reaches your consciousness, are very different from, let's say, if you are just in the audience, just walk in to talk to somebody. And so this is in John's system, it's a sort of like almost like automatic filtering of the information that's out there, because you need to filter because you have finite finite computational capacity. You cannot have everything. So it seems to me that this depersonalization is sort of like a disturbance at that level, right? Like the wrong things get relevant to you, and then it disturbs you.
So I am. So it's slightly different. What I'm trying to say is it's really different. What I want to say is like when that person walks on the stage and look at the things, that person receives lots of information already. That's already processed. It's not filtered. It's not left out. It's just like it's processed so fast and so smoothly that it's not, you don't need to actually pay attention because you just do it. Like when you walk, right? Just like when you walk, you don't think that you need to walk unless you're injured or something. You're very careful where you walk, right? It doesn't mean that your body or brain doesn't receive the necessary information from the inside, you know, and environment to actually make sure that you walk. And actually, it's quite funny because I live in Lisbon, and I don't know if you've been to Lisbon, but the pavement is like with the, you know, calçada portuguesa, you know, and it's like for me, it's such a challenge to work on these things. It's just like I need to pay attention to my foot all the time, whereas my colleagues Portuguese, they walk on this smoothly, right? Because they kind of like integrate in the schema on how they interact in the environment, so they don't need to think about it. I need to think, yeah. But that's something very different to say that actually I'm filtering just the relevant information, I leave everything out. And on the contrary, it's like that information is there, right? It's like it's inside. It's just like you know how to deal with it. And that's based on your prior experiences. Now, imagine that you can't do that anymore because, I don't know, you've been through a trauma, right? So this means that you are on the edge all the time. So this means you cannot afford anymore to just like let it go. It's just like you need to be hyper vigilant all the time.
So a lot of things get into your conscious processing, and then you just shut out something like
so
that.
and after a while that gets overwhelming, and when it gets overwhelming, you just cut and you know, and do things automatically. And it's something like they say it's right quite nicely and strikingly. They say, I feel like I'm an automatic pilot. I'm there, I'm doing stuff, but without being there, right? It's just like somebody else is doing. I know it's myself, doesn't feel like being me. Yeah.
But isn't it automatic when I pick the cherry? All my movements are automatic, so it's normal, no?
So it depends what you mean by I'm sorry. I want to say like an automaton, right? Like a machine. That's something very different from automatic, just like the reflex you're doing. An automaton is where they have this it's difficult to describe. Again, we don't have the vocabulary. They say, I know I'm in control, and they are in control. They're doing stuff. They're actually highly functional. They can hold
So from outside, you don't see this happening.
No. But from the inside, they say, I feel like an empty shell. I don't feel in control, right? It's just like I feel like I'm dead inside. I just like I'm here. Somebody else is like, And they'll even say, I'm doing some from someone there, like a puppet. Yeah. It's like, I'm just like moving myself like a robot, or like I'm like in a dream. I see myself doing stuff, but then without really being there. So there is no more that sense of immersiveness into reality, which I think
see.
it's super important. And for me, this is fascinating because, again, it's connected with the subjectivity of the experiences, right? So subjectivity is not a gloss, it's not an epiphenomenon. That's something like exists there, right? It's so important. And you see it, that it is there only when it gets cracked, when it's like removed or something.
Exactly.
And then you realize, whoa, actually I had that.
And I mean, it happens today. It happens a lot because we have the mind-body dualism, that we notice that we have a body only when there is a problem. You have pain or illness or something, and then you realize you have a body and you go there and try to cure it from a very physical.
Yeah, exactly. But the body is there all the time. I mean,
yeah, and it's good to feel it actually. So that's another thing. It's sort of personal, but like even if I look at Descartes, I think Jan McGilchrist has this description how he describes laughing from a third person point of view, which is kind of crazy, like how he describes all the muscles that are moving when he's laughing, and it's like he was depersonalized somehow from the feeling of having fun or something like that. Whereas, my body is like an immense source of joy. So that was another thing that came up when we were talking about this, that it feels to me that we all have the capacity to move back and forth between automatic and conscious, and especially when we learn something new. So I started jiu-jitsu 2 years ago. I was 50 years old, and I was like the greenest in the oldest and the greenest in the dojo, and it was really an experience to actually go through the process. I've been going through. It's a long one, so I will never be as good as somebody who picks it up young. And that's exactly what I feel there sometimes, that there are so many movements to learn, and I have to re-put my things into my consciousness to move those muscles in that order. And after a while it becomes automatic and transparent, but I have this overwhelming experience of not even physical but more like mental, of learning some new movement. I get, of course, physically tired and beaten up, but also mentally tired in this sort of like moving up and down constantly between automatic and conscious.
Yeah, and then that's a very important point, because that's one of the things that we highlight in one of the papers that I did with Adam Saffron, and I have a couple of actually follow-up studies. And it's like it started with a theory paper, and then I'm almost finished like a couple of empirical studies on this, where I basically contrast experienced meditators with depersonalization. Why? Because in experienced meditator, do you do exactly what you do? Just
exactly. I wanted to ask you about that.
You train the flexibility of giving back and forth, whereas in the case of depersonalization, that flexibility is like gone. You can't. You're just like you're stuck on one mode, right? So you can't really flexibly navigate between the two, right? And I think that's super important. And obviously, the sense of agency is like very
exactly. So isn't it the difference? Because somebody told me that like the physiologically fear and excitement are the same thing. The difference between them is that when you are excited, you feel in control, and when you are in fear, you are not in control.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me like meditation and depersonalization are almost the same thing, except that in meditation you are mastering the moves between
somebody
right?
needs to look at the biochemistry of what is happening at the cellular level when you're excited from fear rather than from joy, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be something very different happening at the chemical level, right?
Fear and excitement.
Yeah.
It's both like an adrenaline thing. That's what I mean. Maybe it's superficial. Maybe you know more about this. But let's go back to meditation and depersonalization, because as you say, it's like when John Vervaeke talks about meditation, he actually uses the glass metaphor, but not the glass you use, like your glasses. That it's usually transparent. You look through it, you look at the world through it. And when you meditate, you basically take it off and look at it.
Mm.
And then you have to put it back. So that's the move when actually you get back into your transparency and look at the world again. So he always talks about how only mindfulness is not enough. A lot of people do meditation, mindfulness, where you basically take off your senses and look at them. And you have pain, you try to actually depersonalize from it and look at it. But then he says you have to have the opposite move too. And he calls it contemplation. It's another practice when you put your glasses back and you look at the world through it. So you learn, you relearn how to use it, and you become conscious about this sort of like vertical move between those two. And so when I read the paper about the personalization, I had constantly this in my mind, that basically this is the same thing, except that in meditation you learn how to play with this.
Mm.
Whereas in depersonalization, it feels like it just falls on top of you, and you are in,
Yeah.
you get
Yeah.
stressed because you
Yeah.
are not in control, right?
Yeah, it's overwhelming. Yeah. So you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty all of a sudden and you're not in control because, well, most of the people you choose to meditate, you even pay to go to the school to meditate. So you have like a strong incentive, right? It's just like I'm going there and I'm paying from my bank account to do this, right? So you feel very much in control of it. But one needs to be careful because there are accounts of depersonalization and psychotic states induced by excessive or some, I don't know, forms of meditation, right? So it really depends on people, depends on many settings, because, well, maybe you're doing a certain practice which is absolutely fine, and then something happens in your life, or I don't know, something, you ate something and that changed completely your metabolism, and then when you do exactly the same practice, that will just like freak you out. So I think people should be careful of this, because it's not one size fits it all. It's not a tool for feeling good. It's a tool for knowing oneself better, right? With whatever that comes, and the self, as I said, is never static. So we are going through phases, ups and downs, and we are evolving, we are changing. So when we see ourselves, we never see ourselves the same twice. We're always
Changing.
somebody else each time.
And at the same time, we are the same. So
Yes.
somehow
Yeah.
I relate to my
Yeah.
3-year-old self.
Yeah.
And so the other thing I was thinking about is this movement. So you actually, if I hear it correctly, even propose it as a therapy for this, that you move. And I do a practice called movement medicine. That's basically a free dance, no choreography, a lot of music. It's sort of related to 5 rhythm, if you know this. So there's an arc of like going slow and go up, fire, and then go down again. And so you have this arc of like 3 hours, and we do have topics about things, and a lot of them is working with like my early childhood before I spoke. Because of the movement, I can go back there. And it's emotionally sometimes really overwhelming. It's amazing how things come up that never comes up in like talk therapy. And in certain situation, I do feel lethargic, like I don't want to move. I just want to lie down on the floor, but I'm aware of it. I'm not the little kid anymore. And one of the instructions, you don't have to do it, but one of the suggestions that the teacher says is that you just move. When you feel that, you just move out of it. So whatever, you don't have to do, there's no choreography. You do whatever you want, just don't stay still, just move, and it goes away.
Yeah, so this is indeed very powerful, but as I said, it's like it's what you say, just move, for me is that imperative, stay alive, right? It's just like, and that means move, right? Just like,
except maybe the freeze.
yes, but that's, you can't keep the freeze state for very long, because for your homeostatic needs, you still need to breathe and eat and all the other functions, so for bodily functions. So yeah, so I think that's important. Yeah.
I mean, it's a fascinating subject. We could go on and on. I would like to ask you about, like, usually do it in the beginning, but I wanted to introduce the subject because it's not, I think it's pretty unknown for most of the people what we have been talking about. So I wanted to introduce a little bit before asking this question, which is, why are you interested in this? So have you ever had this depersonalization experience, or what is attracting you towards researching this subject? So, because in my, theory, there's always something in you that is moving towards the subject, like the love thing, like. So have you ever asked yourself this question, why this subject?
Yes. And you will find my answer a bit surprising, but actually is that question that came to me. So I was in London. I was at this workshop where I was talking about, at that time I was working on face perception, autism, and how we basically, automatically couple our, the social glue, where we basically mimic each other's faces and we feel connected with others, not necessarily through theory of mind, but through very subtle body movements that kind of like gives you hints about you're connected or disconnected. Yeah. And my idea was that autistic people, is not that they don't have theory of mind or drive to connect with each other, but because they have a very different way of perceiving the world. So because the senses basically function differently, right? So you have a different way of integrate different sensory modalities together. So literally we're not perceiving the same event the same way. So this means it can't really form that social group, right? So I was working on that, and obviously I was interested a lot on multisensory integration, face perception and embodiment. And I gave this talk in London, and I had one slide where I looked at atypical sensory experiences and feeling of being like not really in your body. Yeah, it's like just you do stuff, but because you learn how to do it. Yeah, but you're not really there. You're not physically there. And after my talk, I had somebody from the audience that came to me and said, what you're describing there, it's very familiar to me, and this is how I feel all the time. But I'm not diagnosed as an autistic person, so I don't know what's going on here, right? I said, okay, so this is interesting. So yeah, so I started to engage with that person, and later on, that person was diagnosed with depersonalization, and I had a look on the condition, and I realized that, as you said, there's not much there. And for me as a philosopher, that was like mind-blowing, fascinating. What I mean is just like some people that have the that pane of glass, as like the subjectivity in itself kind of like disrupted, and nobody talks about this. It's like that's the thing. There are people that feel like zombies in the world, so who cares about thinking zombies, like thoughts experiments. It's just like, actually there are real people here that have those experiences and they feel this way because their subjectivity is kind of like disrupted. So I think we need to have a closer look at this, because I was, like, as I said, fascinated with the subjectivity of the experiences. And this is how I got actually interested in the phenomena. So it's like literally somebody came to me, and then I realized this. So I don't think I ever experienced depersonalization in the severe forms, but I think each of one of us experienced at a certain point in some way or another. In my case, it comes from the jet lag. So when I'm jet lagged, I'm just like there without really being there, just like I'm doing stuff. Sometimes I even deliver a talk, right? But I'm not, and then I crash and sleep, and then the next day it's fine, yeah. Or you've been heavily drunk, or I don't know, you smoke cannabis or something, and you're kind of like, and then people say that you can come back. But in severe cases, you actually stay in that state, and you can't come back anymore, right? And that's a bit like highly distressing, and as people feel, one of them, Joe Perkins, has this beautiful book called Life on Automatic Pilot, and he says that a condition that makes you feel invisible is invisible in society, right? Because you don't feel real, you feel invisible, you're not really there, you're just a ghost, you're just like going through life like a, automaton, like in a dream. But because you're doing everything so functionally okay, people don't see that it's like something deeply disturbing and distressing in yourself. So it's invisible in society. And that also kind of like motivated me also to join forces of people that already worked on this, and clinicians and neuroscientists and psychologists. I have collaborators all over the world on this, and try to raise awareness. And I'm super happy because right now I have 2 running projects on this, trying to gather some data and try to figure out what's going on. And I look forward.
So usually these people want to change, right? So that's an important part of it, because otherwise it could be just a condition. You're okay with it.
No, they're not okay with it.
They are not okay with it.
Yeah, no.
Does it have to do anything with dissociation?
So, so some people will argue that dissociation, self-detachment is not the same phenomena, and I tend to agree. So for instance, like I know that I suffered from dissociation, and I have proof for that, right? So when I was very young, when I was a kid, I loved music very much. And I was reading notes and everything, so it was pretty good. And then something happened, and that kind of like kept me away from music. And the next day or the next week or something, I wasn't able to read notes anymore, right? Musical notes, right? So that I completely dissociated from that. But that's something very different from self-detachment, because self-detachment is just like you're there, just seeing yourself and doing it. In my case, which is like complete like split, and I think dissociative phenomenon and self-detachment, in the case of depersonalization, obviously there is overlap, because as I said, it's like this, we are one single being. That's like we have many things in common. This is a soup, this is a cocktail, right? With many common ingredients. But I think also that these are two phenomena, because I don't feel self-detached. I'm very much present, but I kind of like dissociated from that part of my life. And cognitively I know, right, like with the tennis ball, I know that that's a tennis ball, but I just like cannot but react in a certain way. In this case, I know that I was good at reading notes. I knew exactly what note that should be, and sing it. And now I can't even know which one is the basic. It's like it's just some dots on some lines, and I know that I should have the knowledge to be able to read that, because I did it for like 12 years, 13 years of my life, right? And it's not as if I don't know that those are notes, right? Musical notes. I know very well that.
And you remember that you knew.
I remember, So it's just like I have very clear, it's not. I haven't lost track of that self. It's just like it's a dissociative phenomenon. It's simply dissociated from that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anna. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
So I usually give the opportunity to my guest to ask me a question.
Okay, so I'm going to ask exactly the same question that you asked me. Now it's just like so what drove you into this, creating this podcast and, wanting to engage with people on this? So what you are after in this endeavor?
Thank you for the question. Very nice. A lot of people ask me that, and I always have a different answer because it's there are so many reasons. But if I connect it to depersonalization, it's basically I have a quest myself to connect my, in spirituality it's called like soul hunting, like the different pieces of my soul to put it together. Because I'm a scientist, I wanted to mention this. I don't know how many scientists feel this. I wouldn't call it depersonalization because what I hear from you, it's a serious condition. But there is some kind of aspect of doing science. We are forced to detach from the subject that we like, because otherwise we wouldn't be attracted to it, right? So there is this move which has a lot of good reasons, which is to avoid self-deception, not to trick ourselves into something that is not true, because we are after the truth. And so there is this move of detaching ourselves from the subject that we study. And this requires a sort of, I don't know how to call it, dissociation of oneself, my scientist self, from the self that was attracted to that subject. And from a very, very like everyday point of view, before AI got leaked from the lab like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was a very hard subject to talk about at dinner conversations. So I had my scientist self who went in the lab, did math, wrote papers, and I went home, I hugged my kids, I had dinner with friends. It was very hard to connect those different lives. So I'm got 50 and I decided to try to do this unification, and this podcast is part of it. So I have a blog. I'm trying to even incorporate things into my research, which is maybe not as easy as if you do psychology or philosophy, because it's somehow closer to your subject. I do AI, so we are actually engineering these kind of systems. But I think this is also very, very useful when I'm thinking about creating these systems. Thinking about like what Michael is doing, for example, about this technological approach of mind everywhere. It's beautiful and it's very useful for thinking about the future AI systems. So there is that part, and there is a lot of self-improvement things like this movement practices, therapy. I doing like cold immersion, which is something like if you cannot be detached from yourself when you're sitting in 0-degree water for 10 minutes, you have to be there, otherwise you die. And it's a very interesting like meditative practice to do this. So there are all these things that I'm doing, plus my work, plus my thinking, and I'm trying to put them together and talk to people who are sort of at the interdisciplinary edges of these different things. So I will talk to researchers like yourself who are researching this kind of psychological aspects, but I will also talk to people who do practices. And then let's see how it connects to AI, how it connects to consciousness, how it connects to the philosophy we are all in love with.
Yeah, that's super interesting and beautiful. But if I may, just like closed loop, because remember we started with this idea. So you started this idea that, well, I have several bits of myself and I want to put like together to create like a self. But for me, what is really interesting that you feel the need to do this through interacting with other people, right?
Yeah.
It's like you're not doing it on yourself in your room, right? So there is something about the fact that, yeah, okay, so I need to put the bits together, but I can't really do it alone. So I really need to interact and get with others. I think that's the most important part. And for me, that's something that has been a bit like overlooked in the literature, simply because, as I said, we start from adult, fully fledged individual, this illusion that we can be alone, but actually we can't, because we are from the very beginning, highly connected with others, ontologically, biologically, at every single levels, and we continue to be related with others, and we need to stay related with them and with the environment. So I think, again, it shows beautifully, as you said, it's like, yes, I felt the need to do this, but I want to do it by
No, I
dialogue.
absolutely agree with you. Like everything we do, we get better in relationships. So I mentioned you movement medicine. I think movement itself is in the common sense. Like people do sports, they go to the gym, etc., because they know that it's good for the body. But one thing in movement medicine that it's a group. So it's almost like a group therapy through movement, and we are forced to enter into relationships with people. There's also contact dance, which is like an embodied relationship. I don't know if you know this, like two people like moving on top of each other, attached at one point, and this point is moving by itself. It's so funny because it's neither you, neither the other who decides where it goes, you know? And there are so many things come out in this practice that you would, maybe group therapy could be similar, but it's because it's movement, it's a much earlier age. So yeah, I completely agree with you. It's also true for personal relationships. Like the best way to, heal from childhood trauma is to find your partner who is ready to grow with you through these practices, and then you grow together, and it's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you very much, Anna. It was
Thank
a
you for the invitation.
pleasure.
Very nice.
And hope you'll get more visibility for this kind of research, because I think it's very, very important.
Thank you. I'm working on it. So for the moment, I'm a bit busy collecting data, because, as I said, it's like I don't want to just sit in the chair. I just like need some data. So I'm quite busy on that side. But then I'm working on it to get visibility.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.